Start the class and then maybe we should do it again.
You don't know who's
Do
recording.
you want us to start talking again?
You don't
know.
know. I did have a student a couple of years ago. He sat right there. He was one of our seniors, and like when class first started, I turned this on. He had like a gong sound that went off. So all of a sudden you have sound effects. I've also been thinking about doing some advertising stuff like during class. Like brought to you by Nabisco and like holding up products and stuff. Like when you watch these YouTube channels. Like today's lecture is brought to you by Lexus. Live to drive. whatever their thing is.
Brought to you by nothing.
Have you ever heard the there's that I won't play it in class, but it's classroom appropriate, but you should go and check it out. Maybe I'll post it on Slack. But there's a thing I think it's the Bob and Tom show where it's from years ago. They do Harry Carey calls the first baseball game.
Okay.
So they got a guy doing a Harry Carey impersonation, and he's like, I haven't seen a miracle like that since. Jesus comes up and hits a bases empty grand slam. Like we haven't seen a miracle like that since Fishes and Loaves Night. Stuff like that. Join us next week for John the John the Baptist Bobblehead Night. Some assembly required. It's really funny. So check it out, dude. It's like. Harry Carey calls the first baseball game. I think just search for that, and you want the full one because there was actually a secondary skit where, they had a 40-day, 40-night rain delay, and there was an arc in the parking lot that stinks to high heaven, that kind of thing. It's like out to throw out the first pitch is he who has not sinned. It's a crowd favorite. All right, so let's get through what we were talking about last time. Are we making some progress on the Mendix stuff? I know some people are having some screens that look a little different than other screens, so just kind of hobble through to get me so I can talk about some of the stuff. So if there's something that you're not getting to quite work the way you think it should work, try to just do a workaround and just keep trucking through so it introduces the concepts to you. It's like I mentioned last time, it's mainly to get you some background stuff while I'm getting through some of this older stuff, and then I'll bring it all together in the end, and we'll look at Python. Okay? So for next class, I'll give you the next two. Just do the best you can. If you get a weird error message, take a screenshot of it, and then maybe look ahead, at least in the thing. If you're stuck and you can't go any farther on your thing, just watch the videos through the end of that so you at least get the material. Yeah. I won't give you an assignment with Mendix just because it's kind of buggy-ish. Yeah. It's really something that allows me to have you doing something related to programming while I'm doing the background stuff. So, but it is important. It's not just a time waster because I'm going to bring some of those things together. It'll make sense why I had you do it when I talk about that. Yeah. But I won't test you on Mendix specifically. There might be topics from Mendix that I'll kind of talk about when we bring the thing together. But get as much out of it as you can. But don't get too stressed grade-wise if something breaks, and just finish watching the videos for that section and just make sure you have the kind of the content in there. That makes some sense? Because I realize there's some zigs and zags that are a little bit weird. It worked better when they were still sitting at version 7.8.0 when it first came out and they hadn't released new versions, because it's almost like they've changed some stuff in some of the videos to use a newer version. So I get it that it's a little bit wonky, so just do the best you can and we'll get through it and move on with life. All right, so last time we were talking iOS versus Android, not so much from a which is better perspective, but really kind of talking about technology in general and from this perspective, operating systems and some decisions they made related to that. And then today we're going to we talked last time about how Android's solving the old Microsoft problem where they're writing an operating system, a piece of software that has to run on a zillion different phones. Just like Microsoft's writing a piece of software that has to run on a zillion different computers. Where Apple writes a piece of software that has to run just on their stuff, whether it's iPhone or Macintosh computers. So if you think about that from a software developer's perspective, the scope of our project, the difficulty of our project might scale depending on who our audience is. If your audience is everybody, all of a sudden your requirements get a lot more difficult. Maybe, so Apple typically falls into that category. People say, well, Apple stuff just works or there's less bugs, or this, that, and the next thing. And even if that's true, part of it's because they are solving an easier problem. They control the software and the hardware of the situation. I started talking about Apple history is kind of where I said we'd start off today. So if we think about that, how many of you hate Apple? And maybe hate isn't have at least a dislike of Apple. You're going to have several people in there, and those are probably the same hands as the Android users, right? How many of you wish Apple was less proprietary? When you hear the word, what does proprietary mean? When I say that word, proprietary, what does that mean to you? Proprietary. Did I spell it right?
You did now?
Did now. Go ahead.
Dealing with only one party, so like they only focus on their technology. They don't allow any
Okay.
other.
Is that good?
I mean, it's good for them because they're solely just Apple. And if you're in the Apple,
Okay, but why is it good for them?
because
Money?
yeah,
Works out in the pocketbook? In general, when you hear the word proprietary, does it kind of have a negative connotation? Yeah, usually, so in contrast, if I say open source, does that have a positive connotation? If something's open source, that's better. It's available to the community for review or upgrades or whatever, this, that, and the next thing. So would it be nice if Apple was less proprietary? Those of you who dislike Apple, would you dislike them less if they were open source?
Yeah.
Do you know once upon a time Apple tried to do that? So one of the problems with Apple is, especially today, we mentioned this, I think last time we were talking about the MacBooks, is they, there's everything's screwed, glued together, soldered together. They're not really upgradable at this point. You pretty much have to get everything you ever want day one. Several years ago, this was in maybe 1998, 99. No, maybe earlier than that. Maybe 95 or 4. Somewhere in that, mid-90s, let's just say. Apple was starting to have some issues. And so they decided to go open source. When I say open source, they allowed their software to run on other people's hardware. So once upon a time, Apple decided to let third-party hardware developers run Mac OS software. So no longer is Apple solving the Apple problem. Now they're trying to solve something more like the Microsoft problem. And it even went farther than that, where not all hardware was created equal. So you could buy, back then is when Apple was still using PowerPC processors, which is different than Intel processors, but kind of unimportant for us. But you could buy 2 computers that had the same specs, but would give you different performance because one was from Apple and one was made by Bob's Garage or something like that. But they both ran the Mac OS. Now, most of us would say, oh, well, that's kind of good. Now, you don't just have to buy an Apple computer from Apple, because in general, when I say Apple, one word that might come to mind is expensive, right?
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, if you can buy off-brand, kind of like when you go to the store and you buy a generic brand vitamin or something instead of the real deal, you save 30% or 40%, whatever it is. Like, hey, if I could buy an off-brand Mac, maybe that would make it be more in most of our price ranges, right? It almost killed them as a company. Almost fell apart as a company when they went that route. They started losing money because so much of their ecosystem was based on them controlling all sides of the equation and people having a perceived value in that. And there is a value in that. Anybody who's ever owned a Mac or ever owned an iPhone typically would never complain that it doesn't work. They complain it's too expensive. Okay, they complain they have more flexibility on the Android side. They can do more things. They're less constrained by the company. But typically, people aren't complaining that Apple stuff doesn't work. All sorts of other things they complain about. But it usually works because they're solving that simpler problem. It only has to work for their stuff. That's it. Okay, it only has to work for their stuff. Now, having said that, during this period of time, and I'm going to kind of we're going to tell the Microsoft story at the same time. We've all heard of a company called Microsoft?
Maybe.
Sounds familiar.
So what's Microsoft famous for?
Windows.
Operating systems initially, right? So OSs. So what was their first OS? So we think of Windows as being the Microsoft thing, right? But before that, they had something called DOS, disk operating system. All right. Now, this is kind of a funny backstory. So this is Bill Gates, right? Bill Gates is the Microsoft guy. So once upon a time, and back then, so this is in the probably somewhere in the early mid 80s, something like that. Remember a company called IBM?
Mm-hmm.
Still around today, right? How many of you think IBM is cool? Are you being paid to say that? Okay. IBM's a stalwart company. They've been around forever, but they're no longer the cool kid, right? You don't. How many of you have an IBM bumper sticker or an IBM hat? You see some people with the Apple hats or something like that. You don't have the IBM hat. This guy he has an IBM tattoo on his chest. I got the Superman logo around there, but that IBM. So now back in the 80s, IBM was the big deal. Really, Microsoft today is kind of like the IBM from back then. Microsoft was cool for a while, but now they've kind of lost their shine. Now they're just kind of, they're that old school tech company that's still important. Well, back then, IBM was the famous company, and they made, servers, and they kind of led the world in technology. But keep in mind, this kind of predated consumer computers. This is during a point in time where a very, very, very small percentage of consumers had a computer at home. So this was right during that time where computers started becoming a thing. So some places like a Radio Shacky type place would sell kits. This is where the original Apple I kind of came from, where Apple had a kit where you can build your own computer. You soldered everything together, and they gave you all the pieces, almost like building a model. And then in the end, it worked. You had a computer, and you felt cool because you built that, right? Where now you go over to Best Buy, and you bring it home, you plug it in. Hi, work. Big thumbs up. That didn't happen back then. But we were starting to move towards that consumer type thing. So Microsoft had a meeting with IBM. So in this meeting, and this is probably, I can't give you backup numbers for this, but there's a reasonable chance this might have been the most profitable meeting in the history of meetings. Right? Because we all kind of, Bill Gates is usually up there in that richest person ever list, right? He was number one for a long, long, long time, and now he's like, I don't know, he's 2 or 3, whatever it is. I think the Amazon guy is one right now. But these guys are worth like $65 billion. Ridiculous money, whatever it is. So Bill Gates and a couple of the other Microsoft guys are sitting across the desk from the IBM suits. The guys sitting there, and you're like, IBM was interested in getting into the personal computer world, but wasn't quite sure whether or not this was going to be something that took off, right? It's like, look, we've been in the business world. We know companies need computers, but does a consumer really need a computer? This is before we knew consumers wanted or needed computers. Mm-hmm. So they were a little bit, hesitant to get into the consumer market since they really owned the business market, and the consumer market didn't even exist before that, really. But they figured, this is starting to become a thing, and maybe we can make some money off of it. And so Microsoft goes in there and says, kind of says, look, we don't want to sell you our operating system. Because that would really be IBM's concern. They would have to lay out too much money to try this out. Instead, Microsoft said, so they revolutionized the idea of licensing software. So Microsoft said, look, we don't want to sell you our software. Instead, every single time you sell an IBM personal computer, we get a licensing fee because you're going to have DOS on that computer. Well, they didn't call it DOS, and you'll see why in a second. You'll have our software in that computer, and we get a licensing fee. So only if they sell a computer does Microsoft get paid. Okay? IBM famous quote. No problem. The real money is in the hardware. Something pretty close to that's what they said. No problem. Real money's in the hardware. Everybody knows the hardware makes way more money than the software. That doesn't even make sense, really. Because software you write once, you can just duplicate it over and over and over again. Where hardware, you have to keep paying for it each time you want to make a new one. Yeah, so the real money is actually in the software. But IBM didn't see it that way because this was so early in the computing world. So they shake hands with Microsoft, saying, yeah, no problem. We're going to make IBM branded PCs, which should sell pretty well because people trust the brand, right? Mm-hmm. And then Microsoft's going to have their operating system on it, and Microsoft gets paid every single time IBM sells a computer. There was one very, very interesting catch to this. Anybody know the fun catch to this deal? Makes Bill Gates look like a genius now. They didn't have one. At the time of this deal, Bill Gates sold IBM on this deal for something he didn't have. All right? So now they come out, they're all excited. We have a deal with IBM to license our operating system to them. Now all we need is an operating system. All we need is the product that we promised to license to them. So they go down the street somewhere, blah, 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 to this kind of a Radio Shack-y type place. And there was so the rumor was there was some guy who worked there who, in his spare time as a hobby, wrote a little operating system. Okay, and Bill Gates walks in off the street and says, hey, we hear you have an operating system. This little nerdy guy's like, yeah, it's just my fun thing I've been working on. We'll give you $50,000 for it. Okay, so you're a guy who's, selling little trinkets to nerds, and you have this like fun piece of software that you weren't even trying to sell, and somebody comes off the street and offers you $50,000 in the mid '80s, which is worth more money than that today, right? Mm-hmm. What do you say? You say yes. Yeah. Okay. You say yes. So then Microsoft now has an operating system. Do you think Microsoft made a little bit more than $50,000 off that operating system?
A little bit.
A little bit more. Yeah, they did all right with that. A lot more zeros. A lot more zeros. So they bought the OS for $50,000. I think that's about the number. And then that became the basis for today's operating systems. Now, then we had a period of time where Microsoft and Apple were buddies. Okay, these two companies were buddies. So the early Apple computers ran DOS. They ran Microsoft software. Same licensing thing. So Apple would pay Microsoft a licensing fee every single time one of their Apple computers sold. Now, and the video is actually out on YouTube. You can watch it. You can kind of see Bill Gates' reaction. Some of them were kind of grainy, but Apple introduced a product line called Macintosh that we're familiar with today, right? We call it a Mac today. All right, so internally at Apple, they had two different products. They had the Apple team and they had the Macintosh team. Now, the Apple team was pretty heavy in education. And so you had these computers, kind of small computers that just had a 5 1/4 inch floppy drive thing in it. Like, have you ever seen a floppy disk? Mm-hmm. These are big floppies. Now, not the little. Yeah, these are bigger ones. 5 1/4. You're thinking about 3.5. Mm-hmm. But in any case, that ran DOS. Those computers ran DOS, and they have text-based stuff on there and things like that. But then they introduced a new group inside the company called the Macintosh group, and Steve Jobs was pretty focused on that group. And the whole idea of the Macintosh group was they would have an operating system with a graphical user interface. So you used a mouse. So they introduced the whole. I mean, before that, you didn't have mice. You didn't have clicky. You just used keyboard for everything. So internally, when Apple introduced the Macintosh group, Steve Jobs kind of headed that and went out and hired somebody else to. So Apple hired a CEO to run Apple, so Steve Jobs could run Mac Group. All right, and the guy's name's escaping right now, but he was the CEO of Pepsi. All right. And another famous quote Steve Jobs said to this guy, do you want to change the world or sell sugar water the rest of your life? Something close to that. So maybe I shouldn't use quotes, but pretty close to that. All right, do you want to change the world or sell sugar water the rest of your life? So this guy comes over to Apple. Now, this operating system that Apple was using, they actually didn't create it. So kind of in this same time period, any of you heard of a company called Xerox?
Yeah.
What is Xerox? What does that company do? Printers, copy machines, that kind of junk. So Xerox internally was working on a personal computer. Everybody was working on a personal computer back then, you know. But we were in hindsight, you say, oh well, everybody should have been working on personal computers, right? But you know, at the time, who knew if they were going to take off or just be this giant flop? Well, Xerox internally had been working on this project that used a mouse and a graphic user interface, and they were kind of the first ones to be doing that at a, let's call it a almost completed level. And then they internally decided to scrap that project. They said, you know what? The real money's in printers. Now, they've done okay, right? It's not like they were this giant loser. Maybe they lost out on some money, but Xerox is still they make a lot of money off printers and stuff like that. Less than they maybe would have made off personal computers, but who knows? They might not have worked out in personal computers. So Xerox invited Apple engineers into, let's just say, give them the Xerox Star, which was the code name for their product that had the keyboard, or I'm sorry, that had the mouse and the graphic user interface. So Apple then integrates this mouse base GUI OS into the Mac. And while they're on stage, so and in this period of time, Apple and Microsoft had a relationship because every Apple computer that shipped would have a license for the Microsoft's DOS that came with it. So while Steve Jobs is on stage announcing the first Macintosh with this thing, they start getting word that some machines are shipping in China running Microsoft Windows, which was, let's just call it, heavily borrowed from the operating system that was given to Apple. So, yeah, who knows where ethical lines were crossed. So obviously that added a level of strife between Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. They were not friends after that, right? So they parted ways over that little fight. And it just so happened that Macintosh kind of became the next line, right? Like today, can you go out and buy an Apple computer, or do you buy a Macintosh computer made by the company called Apple?
Yeah.
That's what you buy. There aren't two different versions, right? Mm-hmm. You don't have the Apple computer and the Macintosh computer. It's only the Mac made by the company called Apple. Or is it the company called Apple? So this guy down here, the CEO of Pepsi, convinces the Apple board to fire Steve Jobs from his own company. How can he do that?
Businessman.
It's a publicly traded company. It's not owned by the individuals. It's owned by the shareholders, and it's run by the board of directors. So the board of directors, I mean, he still owned shares of Apple, but he no longer was running the company. Out the door. You're fired. You're a lunatic. Because he was all in this Macintosh thing, and the Macintosh didn't do that well early on. Right? Now, once he was out the door, so after Steve Jobs was out the door, this is when Apple started their open source thingy. Okay, they started their open source thingy, which made them lose lots of money over a period of time. How many of you knew that Steve Jobs was fired from Apple? Right? Half of you, okay. Anybody know what he did while he was fired from Apple?
He saved Pixar.
All right, yep. So Pixar. So yeah, the way I usually tell this is, so he was buddies with who's the Star Wars guy? George Lucas. So buddies with George Lucas. George Lucas was going through a particularly expensive divorce. Wanted to offload some assets. So I think the sale price was something like $3 million or so for a little company called Pixar. You all heard of Pixar?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Yeah. Well, now they do. So Steve Jobs owned Pixar for a while, the CEO of Pixar. Then they sold Pixar to Disney years and years and years later for something like $7.5 billion. And he remained in control of the board. So $3 million turns into $7.5 billion, and that doesn't even include the money he made from it in the middle, from all the movies and stuff. Okay, so Steve Jobs did Pixar. Kept his family fed. Right?
What a man.
Yeah. Anything else he did? What else did he do in the middle there? You think Pixar was the most important thing he did?
No, but it did turn around. It did turn around.
Oh, didn't he? What did he do? He
Created a company
what was it called though?
called Next Computers.
Okay, it was next.
Now, let me show you something here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that.
So here's the Next Computer logo. Oh, there he is. There's Steve Jobs with Next Computers. How many of you have ever heard of Next Computers?
I've seen the logo.
Besides the book.
All right, so Steve Jobs went out, created Next Computers. The whole idea here is it was supposed to be best of both worlds, compatible with Mac and PC, because this was definitely during a time where if you were a Mac user, only Mac users could use documents that you created. If you were a PC user, only PC users could use it. If you put a Macintosh formatted floppy disk in your PC, it would ask you to if you wanted to format it, so on and so forth. So you had this major issue of going between computers. Where now we kind of have some, that's not really an issue anymore. Sometimes you have some file format issues or something like that, but in general, you can go to either computer and things just work. So Next Computers ended up being successful in education, but they were really expensive. Okay? Now, these two things are happening at the same time. Well, that's happening at the same time as Apple is doing their open sourcey thing, just bleeding money. Apple really almost failed as a company. We look at Apple today and we think about them as basically the most valuable company in the world, publicly traded, right?
Mm-hmm.
They just got buku dollars. I mean, they're worth more than Exxon. That's gas. All right, that's oil. So, what happened?
Did we hire him?
So obviously, before his death, Steve Jobs was with Apple, right? So somewhere in there, he came back.
Mm-hmm.
Now they didn't actually rehire him because they actually left on some bad terms. But Apple acquired. Keep in mind they didn't have any money. They acquired. Did I misspell that?
I think she did.
Yeah, AC.
There we go.
Perfect. I like it.
Right. Apple acquired Next Computers. All right, they acquired Next Computers, which came with Steve Jobs, who they installed as the interim CEO. All right. So he was the interim CEO. And it was from this point forward. So after Next Computers, what did Steve Jobs come out with? He came out with the iMac, the iPod, just a little bit successful, the iPod, the iPhone. They did actually have something called the iBook, which was a laptop that actually was pretty interesting. It had its own built-in little carrying thing.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. They're very colorful, cutesy things. This was back when they were doing all the color things. So, iBook.
So they fired him and they bought him back.
Yeah, this thing.
Well,
It's kind of familiar.
Yeah.
Where have I seen them?
And they have a little handle on this side. So,
They bought next computers and came with Steve.
yeah, there you go.
They bought him back.
There you go.
They never actually.
There's the handle. Yeah, they didn't hire Steve Jobs. They bought the computer they bought the company he ran and just kept him with it and installed him as the interim CEO until they figured it out.
Yeah, so they bought
Okay.
him back.
Now, were all these things minus the iBook pretty successful? Okay, so this guy, ridiculously successful. You figure, okay, well, nothing's going to beat the iPod until iPhone came out, right? Which they made even more money. Right now, most of their income per year comes from iPhone or iPad. Yeah, we got the iPad in there too, right? All right, so all these things that they did. So did that put Apple back on the map? Okay, so I'm going to show you something here. So this is developer.apple.com. So if you're a computer programmer today and you're working with Apple stuff, we have this object in here called among other things, strings in this language are represented as NS strings. It's a class called NS strings. And we have a whole bunch of other NS things. Now this is in today's Apple library for writing software for Macs. NS equals next step. Apple today is Next Computers with an Apple logo on it. Something that they came out with after this also was Mac OS X, okay, which was a Unix-based OS based off of Next Computers, which was also Unix-based. They just put a nice fancy front end on it. And then they just slapped the old Apple logo because people knew the Apple logo, right? I mean, they kept some of the things around from Apple, but really Apple today is Steve Jobs' Next Computers with a nice logo on it. Many of the things that Steve Jobs created as part of the engineering for Next Computers, he had this like super, super expensive manufacturing plant for putting the computers together that did all sorts of crazy things, was the foundation for what Apple does today. Every time they release something new, they're like showing you, how they've invented a new metal for something. Like, we've put soybeans into the gold, and it creates a biodegradable metal that's actually edible. So why throw out your laptop when it's run out of its lifespan when you could just have it for dinner?
Why didn't you put like an apple?
You get somebody with an eating disorder just snacking on their laptop in class, and they just eat a little bit too much. They get into the components. It's like stress eating. All right, so in any case, Apple today is Next Computers with a logo on it. So Steve Jobs basically came back and saved the company. In fact, for a good period of time, he was making Apple's payroll out of his own pocket, along with a loan from Microsoft. I got to go back one more. When Steve Jobs returned, Microsoft helped them stay afloat. Why would they do that? Go ahead. Okay, you could say competition drives sales, but at that point in time, if you were talking to Apple fanboys, they would say, it was much closer to a 50-50 competition, but it was really more like a 98-2% competition. So really Apple or Microsoft really controlled it. Go ahead.
competition creates better push for technology advancement.
There might be some truth there, but Apple was never really known to be a software company. Apple makes software that runs on their own hardware, but they're really known as a product company, right? You buy hardware and it just kind of works. Where Microsoft, besides like keyboards or something like that, they really don't make stuff. They make software. Go ahead.
They want to show that they're dominant. They're helping Apple as the time because they're able to.
What's Microsoft's bread and butter? How do they make their money? Licensing software. Okay. Now, would Microsoft accept the fact that some people are going to use Apple computers?
Mhm.
I mean, they're not going to have 100% of the market. They can try to. They can try how close to it. But some people are going to use Apple computers. So there is going to be some people are going to be using computers that are not running the Microsoft operating system. So did Microsoft maybe see an opportunity to have some of their other software packages, like Microsoft Word, for example, being on the Mac so they can make money off those Mac users too? Sure. I wonder why I'm getting so many calls. So they helped them stay afloat. And there's actually another interesting video you can find on YouTube where Apple was giving one of their big worldwide developer conference meetings. So you have Steve Jobs on stage, the whole room of Apple people, and you have this giant screen in the background. And he introduces something, and what pops up on the screen is Steve Jobs' huge face, live. He's video chatting in or whatever. So basically Steve Jobs looking over this crowd of people, this giant face of him. This is the enemy. All right. And this is when Microsoft and Apple got back together because Steve Jobs says Apple needs Microsoft so that we can bring some of their products like Microsoft Word, the Office stuff over to the Mac. Okay. So this is what kind of kept things afloat for a period of time. That makes some sense? All right. So that's kind of our backstory with Microsoft and Apple and how they got to where they are today. So if we pull this back towards the programming stuff, I filled in some stuff over here last time. So we had been sitting on C++. So we talked about C. We said C supported variables so we could have name value pairs for remembering stuff. We also had this thing called an array, which is a collection of the same kind of values. We had this thing called a struct, which is similar. I think somebody over here, when I originally mentioned this, said, is this like a dictionary in languages like Python? It is. So you had name value pairs, but they didn't have to necessarily be the same type. You could have a person whose first name was Mike, last name is Littman, age is 21, that kind of stuff. Just turned 21, actually. Problem is that the types of problems we were solving became more complex. Language started showing us weakness. So that's where we talked about object-oriented languages versus procedural languages, and we used like a telephone as an example. So the C language would have allowed us to create a telephone that looked like that pile of wires. C++ gave us a tool that would allow us to stuff all those wires into something called a class, hiding most of the detail from us and only having the public interfaces poke out. So that's where, did I do the C++ slide yet? Yeah, here we go. That's where C++ comes in. We kept the variables, we kept the arrays, we kept the structs. A problem with the structs, though, is it didn't allow us to do embedded functions. So the idea here is once we stuff all those wires into a phone, we expect this phone to be able to make phone calls and other things. We expect it to be able to do things rather than just remember things. Okay? We don't want to have to go over someplace else and plug the phone in for it to make a phone call. We want it to be able to do stuff. So a struct could remember a person's first name, a last name, stuff like that, but a struct could not make a person wave. Something like that. It didn't have the ability for that representation to do more than just remember things. So a class was kind of a superstructure. It allowed you to have all those name value pairs, but then it also allowed you to embed what are called functions into it. So if we give a quick definition of a function, This is a set of instructions that we write once and can use over and over. All right, so we can write a function that accomplishes some task. Maybe it's 5, 6, 7 lines of code, 100 lines of code, whatever it is. We name it, and then we can use that a whole bunch of times whenever we need to perform that logic. Okay? So it allowed us to embed those inside of these objects. And that'll make sense once we start getting into that stuff. This is the high-level version of this. All right, so now, let me steal this slide. So notice here, the problem with C++ is it empowered the programmer to make poor decisions. Okay, that means that we have a lot of access to memory in C++. So the example I probably used when I first mentioned this was in C++, a programmer could write something where, let's say you were inviting me to a party. Rather than giving me the address of where your house is, you would hand me the house and tell me to open the door at 8 or something like that. And we would say in real life, it never makes sense to hand somebody a house because houses are heavy, right? Mm-hmm. So a language like C++ would empower the programmer to make this decision. Now, that's less of a problem today, but remember a couple of classes ago, we were talking about the cost of memory, right? Memory in the C and C++ years was really expensive. I mentioned that 8 megabytes of RAM in 1996 was $1,000, $1,000, okay? C++ had already been out for a while. So the fact that we were using up an amount of memory big enough to hold a house, or they allowed you to do that, would be destructive, right? Today we don't care. How big's the house? It'll fit my 16 gigs of RAM, no problem. Who cares? Okay. Maybe it's less of an issue today. So today we have enough horsepower around us that we can just be bad programmers, and it's like fine, right? Isn't that like if you're like in the logging business and you're cutting down a tree, you don't really know what you're doing. Well, maybe somebody who has skill can use like a smaller chainsaw, but if you get a big enough chainsaw, you can get that tree down. So we surround ourselves with power tools. I like why do they even have competitions for that? Like I see these guys on TV.
Like how fast you can do it.
Yeah, but so they basically like build their own chainsaws with like a V8 engine on it. Like this thing is barely like they can barely lift the thing. So they can like just cut through a tree in 2 seconds? What's the point?
Well, there is no point. That's what makes
Just
it
cause?
Yeah, just
Same thing as same competitions. They have the guys that use the little rope thing to climb the tree really fast.
Is that what you can do when you get up there?
They slide back down really quick because your time doesn't stop till you hit the ground.
Just fall. Yeah, just fall up.
Yeah, I know.
Bad for your knees.
But then you win.
Yeah. What do you win?
Like who decided that should be like something that like we compete over? Like someday some guy did that and says, I'm pretty good at this useless thing. I bet you I'm faster than you. And then it just turned into a thing.
Once a year we should do that. It's crazy.
That's right. Well, I was just, the same thing like with snowboarding and stuff like that. It was just like we were talking about at the beginning of class. Like every year they come up with a crazier and crazier tricks, right? They spin more times and like who decided like let's go on to like a really slippery surface and go on like a really steep hill. Fly up into the air 15, 16 feet and just spin around as many times as we can and see if we can survive the fall. Okay. Now let's do that many times in a row.
So my TV falling, I guess.
Yeah. Some guy almost had an accident, did something really cool, survived, and somebody said, do that again.
And then you hurt.
The first time I ever went skiing, I actually had a situation like that. I went with like a church group. My buddies had been before. I had never been skiing before. So we get to the top, and I guess the left is like where the bunny hill was, and the right. I mean, this was poorly designed. Okay, so the right was like the black diamond. Like right. So I made one wrong turn. Okay, and I go from the beginner hill to death. Okay, I start hitting moguls. Okay, I'm hitting these little jump, and the thing is, I was going so fast, I was so out of control that I didn't fall down. Okay, so I mean, I like look like I know what I'm doing, and I am completely out of control, and I don't know how to stop. Okay, so I get to the end, and like around the ski lodge there, they had like the, you know, like a little, like almost like a wooden bridge thing that you go that would take you into. So I jump it. Okay. I jump it, turn around sideways, land perfectly. Step out of my skis. I mean, like I knew what I was doing. Like people were impressed. Okay, I cheated death a minimum of 24 times during that like 40 seconds.
It's like, hey.
Yeah, this is. No, you act like you know what you're doing, right? Yeah, go inside and change my pants.
I wish somebody got that on video.
This might have been before video. Somebody had etched this into like a wood carving or something like that. All right, so next class, we're going to, here, let me just start did I already write I'm going to drag this one down to the bottom just so I remember where to start off. With Java. All right, so hopefully we can finish up the programming language stuff on Friday and either Monday or Wednesday get into some of the Python stuff. So we should be rounding the thing. I'll put up so do the next 2 modules for Friday, and I'll see everybody then.
Okay.